Hey everyone! Tonight we're settling in for a very long journey through one of history's most sprawling stories, the rise and fall of Rome. Now, before you get too comfortable under those blankets, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these long-form historical narratives for sleep. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our global community settling in for the night with some ancient history. Now, dim those lights. Maybe adjust your pillow, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to trace the story of Rome from a small, unremarkable city by a muddy river to the master of the Mediterranean world. And then, because this is history, we'll watch it all slowly crumble away. It's a story spanning over 2,000 years, filled with legendary figures, massive battles, political intrigue, and the kind of slow, inevitable decay that makes for perfect bedtime listening. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the 7 hills beside the Tiber River in the 8th century BC. There's nothing particularly special about this place. No grand monuments, no marble temples, just some scattered huts and the occasional shepherd. Yet from these humble beginnings would grow an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to Persia. Tonight, we'll explore how that happened and why it couldn't last forever. But let's start at the very beginning with the Romans themselves and the stories they told about their origins. Because like many ancient peoples, the Romans weren't entirely sure where they came from. Historical records from their earliest centuries had been lost when Gallic tribes sacked and burned their city in 390 BC. So what we have instead are legends, carefully crafted stories that tell us less about what actually happened and more about what the Romans wanted to believe about themselves. According to Roman legend, their story begins not in Italy, but with the fall of Troy. When that great city burned, a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped with a small band of followers. After years of wandering, he arrived in Italy, where he married into a local royal family and founded the city of Alba Longa. His descendants ruled there for 400 years, until 2 brothers, Numitor and Amulius, came to blows over the throne. Amulius won, deposing his brother and making Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin to ensure the royal bloodline would end with her. This was always a questionable strategy in a world where gods regularly intervened in human affairs. Sure enough, Mars, the god of war, visited Rhea Silvia and gave her twin sons, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius discovered the twins, he ordered them to be drowned in the Tiber River. But the servants, perhaps moved by pity or fear of the gods, simply left the babies by the riverbank. There, according to legend, they were found by a she-wolf who nursed them until shepherds discovered the children and raised them as their own. The twins grew up strong and bold, eventually learning their true heritage and overthrowing the usurper Amulius. With their grandfather restored to power, Romulus and Remus decided to found their own city near the spot where they had been abandoned. But as so often happens when brothers share power, they quarreled. During a dispute over the boundaries of their new settlement, Romulus killed Remus, becoming the sole founder and first king of what would be called Rome in his honor. The story continues with Romulus facing an immediate problem. His new city needed people. So he opened Rome's gates to exiles, escaped slaves, and assorted outcasts from across Italy. These early Romans then faced another problem, a shortage of women. To solve this, they invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival, and then during the festivities, abducted the Sabine women en masse. This episode, known as the Rape of the Sabines, led to war. But eventually, the two peoples were united under Romulus's rule. After Romulus, 6 more kings supposedly ruled Rome. The last 3 came from the Etruscan city of Tarquini, including the final king, Tarquin the Proud, whose arrogance and tyranny so angered the Romans that they drove him out and established a republic in 509 BC. From there, according to legend, Rome was destined to conquer Italy and then the Mediterranean world. Now, as bedtime stories go, this origin tale has everything: divine intervention, abandoned babies, nursing wolves, fratricide, mass kidnapping, and the overthrow of tyrants. It's dramatic, memorable, and utterly convenient for later Roman propaganda. But it's almost certainly not true, at least not in the way the Romans told it. Archaeological evidence suggests Rome developed gradually from several small settlements that eventually merged, not from a single founding moment in 753 BC. Yet these myths tell us something crucial about Roman identity. They reveal a people who saw themselves as survivors and scrappy underdogs, descendants of Trojan refugees and abandoned infants who had clawed their way to greatness through determination and divine favor. They were comfortable with the idea that their city had been founded by outcasts and misfits, that violence had been present from the very beginning, and that their strength came from absorbing and integrating foreign peoples. Most importantly, the story established two core Roman values that would persist for centuries: an openness to new citizens, regardless of their origins, and an absolute hatred of kings. The Roman Republic that emerged from these legends would be defined by both traits: welcoming foreigners while maintaining a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power. The Roman Republic, which supposedly began in 509 BC, was at least initially a fairly modest affair. Rome controlled only a small territory around the city itself and was constantly at war with its neighbors: the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the south, and various other Italian tribes scattered across the peninsula. These early centuries of Roman history are poorly documented, but they appear to have been defined by slow, methodical expansion and the gradual development of Roman institutions. The government of the early republic was a complex mixture of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. Executive power rested with two consuls, elected annually to prevent either from accumulating too much authority. The judicial system was managed by praetors, while quaestors handled state finances, and aediles were responsible for maintaining the city itself. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, technically had no legal power to make laws, but its opinions carried enormous weight and were usually implemented by the relevant officials. This system was designed to be deliberately slow and cumbersome, requiring cooperation and compromise rather than quick, decisive action. Initially, all of these positions were held by patricians, members of Rome's hereditary nobility. But the plebeians, who made up the majority of the population and the army, gradually demanded political rights of their own. They achieved this through a series of strikes, literally refusing to serve in the military until the Senate granted them concessions. By 287 BC, the plebeians had won the right to marry patricians, to hold their own assemblies, to elect their own representatives called tribunes, and eventually to serve as consuls, praetors, and other magistrates. In theory, at least, the Roman Republic had become a system where merit mattered more than birth. This mixed constitution, as the historian Polybius called it, was one of Rome's greatest strengths. It forced different classes and interests to work together, created multiple checks against tyranny, and allowed for gradual reform rather than violent revolution. The flexibility of Roman institutions would prove crucial as the small city-state gradually became the master of the Mediterranean world. But all of this political development was happening against a backdrop of almost constant warfare. Rome's strategy during these early centuries was essentially defensive expansion. They would never attack anyone unprovoked, they claimed. But if they suspected that someone might attack them, they would strike first in self-defense. This doctrine of preemptive retaliation allowed Rome to justify wars of conquest, while maintaining the fiction that they were always fighting just wars blessed by the gods. The process was slow and methodical. Rome would defeat an enemy, impose a treaty that was relatively generous by ancient standards, and then gradually integrate the defeated peoples into the Roman system. Unlike many ancient conquerors who simply enslaved or exterminated their enemies, Rome offered a path to citizenship and inclusion. This policy created a growing network of allies, and eventually fellow citizens, who had a stake in Rome's success. By 280 BC, this patient strategy had brought most of central and southern Italy under Roman control. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia, seeing the writing on the wall, called for help from Pyrrhus, an ambitious king from Epirus. Pyrrhus was a brilliant general who won 2 battles against the Romans, but his victories were so costly that he abandoned his campaign and returned to Greece. His name lives on in the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a win so expensive it might as well be a defeat. With Pyrrhus gone, Rome conquered the remaining Greek cities and found itself master of the Italian peninsula. But this expansion brought them into conflict with Carthage, the great maritime power that controlled much of the western Mediterranean. The resulting Punic Wars would test Roman determination like nothing before and established Rome as a truly Mediterranean power. Carthage was everything Rome was not. Where Rome stood as a land-based power reliant on citizen soldiers, Carthage functioned as a maritime empire bolstered by commerce and sustained by mercenaries. Rome, comparatively nascent and unpolished, contrasted with Carthage's antiquity and refinement. While Rome integrated conquered populations, Carthage was content to exert economic dominance. For centuries, these 2 entities coexisted peacefully, yet the expansion of Roman influence into Sicily inevitably sparked conflict. The initial Punic War commenced almost inadvertently in 264 BC, stemming from Roman and Carthaginian involvement in a minor Sicilian dispute. This 23-year struggle, predominantly waged at sea, presented Rome with an immediate challenge: the absence of a significant navy. However, instead of conceding defeat, the Romans demonstrated their characteristic adaptability. Roman engineers meticulously examined salvaged Carthaginian vessels, reverse engineering an entire fleet. They trained their crews on shore, practicing rowing on stationary wooden platforms. Upon finally taking to the water, Roman naval tactics, though rudimentary, proved effective. They ingeniously devised bridges to connect their ships, transforming sea battles into land engagements where Roman soldiers could leverage their superior combat prowess. Despite losing entire fleets to storms and inexperience, the Romans persistently rebuilt. Carthage, despite its naval supremacy, could not rival Rome's resolve and resources. The war concluded with Roman triumph and the annexation of Sicily, marking Rome's first overseas territory. Yet Carthage was not definitively vanquished. While Rome was preoccupied with conflicts against the Gauls and Arians, the Carthaginians, under Hamilcar Barca's command, expanded into Spain, seeking new silver sources to rejuvenate their strength. Hamilcar's son, Hannibal, grew up harboring a profound hatred for Rome and a desire for retribution. In 219 BC, Hannibal initiated hostilities by attacking Saguntum, a Roman ally in Spain. In response, Rome declared war, and Hannibal embarked on an audacious undertaking. He led an army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps and into Italy. The appearance of these colossal animals, unfamiliar to Italy, instilled widespread dread among the Romans. Although most elephants perished during the arduous mountain crossing, their psychological impact was profound. For the subsequent 16 years, Hannibal traversed Italy, securing repeated victories through his superior strategy and leadership. His most stunning triumph occurred at Cannae in 216 BC, where he executed a decisive encirclement, annihilating a Roman army twice the size of his own. An estimated 50,000 Romans perished on that single day, representing the most devastating defeat in Roman history. Any other state would have surrendered. Rome's reaction was remarkably resilient. They essentially regrouped and assembled new armies for the following year. This unwavering refusal to capitulate, even in the face of catastrophic losses, was perhaps Rome's greatest asset. Unable to counter Hannibal's tactical brilliance, they simply denied him the decisive engagement he sought. Instead, they harried his forces, disrupted his supply lines, and gradually wore him down. Concurrently, a young Roman general named Scipio was dispatched to Spain, where he systematically subjugated Carthaginian territories and severed Hannibal's reinforcement routes. Scipio meticulously studied Hannibal's tactics at Cannae, learning how to effectively counter them. When he eventually launched an invasion of North Africa, Hannibal was compelled to return to defend Carthage itself. the two commanders finally confronted each other at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. According to the historian Livy, on the eve of the battle, Hannibal, perhaps sensing impending defeat, engaged in a philosophical discourse on the capriciousness of fortune and requested peace. Scipio, while expressing respect for his adversary, stated that he had progressed too far to retreat. The ensuing battle was fiercely contested, but Scipio's strategic prowess proved superior. Hannibal's defeat marked the end of the Second Punic War and solidified Rome's dominance in the western Mediterranean. Scipio was celebrated as Africanus for his victory, but more significantly, the war underscored Roman resilience. They had endured defeats that would have crippled any other power, yet they persevered and ultimately triumphed. The Third Punic War, occurring 50 years later, more closely resembled an execution than a conflict. Rome, increasingly apprehensive and resentful of Carthage's resurgence, witnessed the elder senator Cato conclude every speech with the pronouncement, "Carthage must be destroyed." In 146 BC, Roman legions laid siege to Carthage, captured the city, enslaved its populace, and razed it to the ground. Later accounts suggest the Romans deliberately salted the earth to prevent future cultivation, a detail likely legendary, but symbolically capturing the thoroughness of the Roman victory. The Punic Wars fundamentally transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. However, these conflicts also initiated societal changes within Rome that would ultimately prove detrimental. Extended military campaigns disrupted traditional agriculture, leading to the consolidation of land ownership among the wealthy while impoverishing small farmers. The influx of slaves from conquered lands further eroded the value of free labor. Most critically, the wars cultivated a class of professional generals whose allegiance increasingly lay with their troops rather than the state. With Carthage eliminated and the western Mediterranean secured, Roman attention shifted eastward towards the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from the fragmented empire of Alexander the Great. These campaigns differed from Rome's earlier struggles. The Punic Wars had been a matter of survival, whereas the Eastern Wars were deliberately pursued for glory, plunder, and strategic advantage. Macedon was subjugated first, its phalanxes unable to withstand the adaptability of the Roman legions. The Seleucid Empire, encompassing Syria and Anatolia, subsequently experienced Roman might, with its armies dispersed and its territories annexed or relegated to client status. Egypt, the least powerful of the successor states, submitted peacefully and became a Roman protectorate. Perhaps most notably, Greece itself was conquered in 146 BC, the same year Carthage was destroyed. The Roman sack of Corinth, with its invaluable art and libraries, sent shockwaves through the civilized world. However, Rome was no longer content with its image as a crude Italian upstart. It began systematically appropriating Greek art and culture, transporting statues, paintings, and entire libraries back to Rome. This cultural appropriation was as significant as military conquest. Greek philosophy, art, literature, and architecture permeated Rome, profoundly altering its society. As the poet Horace would later observe, captive Greece captured its savage conqueror. While Rome may have militarily subdued Greece, Greek culture intellectually conquered Rome. By 100 BC, Rome controlled the entirety of the Mediterranean basin, which they began referring to as Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea. Commerce flowed unimpeded across the provinces. Roman law imposed order upon diverse populations, and Roman engineering, evident in its roads, aqueducts, and harbors, provided the infrastructure that unified the empire. For the first time in history, the entire Mediterranean world was unified under a single governing entity. Nevertheless, this rapid expansion precipitated new challenges. The traditional Roman system of governance, designed for a city-state, proved inadequate for a vast empire. Provincial governorships bestowed immense power and wealth upon individuals, creating fertile ground for corruption and abuse. The influx of slaves from conquered territories disrupted established Roman societal structures, while the wealth generated from tribute and plunder exacerbated significant economic disparities. Most perilously, the military underwent a transformation. Roman legions had historically comprised citizen farmers who served for limited periods before returning to their agrarian pursuits. Prolonged campaigns in distant provinces rendered this model unsustainable. Increasingly, Rome relied on professional soldiers whose primary loyalty was directed towards their commanders rather than the state. These seasoned legionaries depended on their generals for retirement benefits, land grants, and protection. This fostered a volatile environment where ambitious politicians could assemble personal armies and employ them to intimidate adversaries. The Roman Republic, which had weathered foreign invasions and external threats, now confronted its most formidable challenge from within. The very success of Roman conquest had sown the seeds of internal strife and civil war. The crisis of the Roman Republic commenced, ironically, with an attempt at reform. In 133 BC, a young tribune named Tiberius Gracchus proposed the redistribution of public lands to Rome's burgeoning population of landless poor. The concept itself was not novel. Similar legislation had existed previously, but the concentration of wealth and land in the hands of a select senatorial elite had reached critical levels. The inherent problem was that many of the senators tasked with voting on the law were precisely the affluent landowners who stood to lose property should it pass. When a fellow tribune, prompted by the Senate, vetoed the proposal, Tiberius orchestrated his removal, a maneuver technically lawful but unprecedented. As Tiberius sought re-election to safeguard himself from potential prosecution, his senatorial opposition opted for direct action. On election day, the Pontifex Maximus and a contingent of senators armed themselves with bludgeons and clubs, launching an assault on Tiberius and his supporters. In the ensuing chaos, Tiberius was bludgeoned to death, along with approximately 300 of his adherents. This marked the first instance in Roman history where political disagreements erupted into fatal violence within the city itself. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius, assumed the tribuneship and embarked on even bolder reforms. He implemented grain distribution to the urban poor, overhauled the judicial system to curb senatorial corruption, and advocated for extending citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. For a period, he commanded remarkable popularity as a politician in Rome, but his proposal to grant citizenship to non-Romans met with significant opposition from existing citizens. When riots erupted in 121 BC, the Senate enacted its first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, essentially a decree of martial law authorizing the consuls to employ any necessary measures to restore order. Gaius and his allies entrenched themselves on the Aventine Hill, but were ultimately vanquished by senatorial forces. Gaius perished in the conflict, along with 3,000 of his adherents. The demise of the Grey Brothers signified a pivotal moment in Roman history. Political brutality, once unimaginable, became a regular occurrence. The implements employed in these confrontations escalated from cudgels to swords to entire armies. Within a single generation, Roman commanders would direct their legions into the very heart of the city. The Republic's final century was characterized by a series of increasingly calamitous civil wars. Marius and Sulla, two accomplished generals, vied for dominion over the state, with Sulla ultimately assuming the role of dictator and eliminating his adversaries through proscription lists, essentially state-sanctioned murder. Upon Sulla's retirement, with the mistaken belief that he had re-established order, the cycle of violence merely recommenced. The fundamental issue lay in the Roman constitution's lack of any mechanism for peacefully resolving profound disagreements. When traditional political avenues became obstructed by filibustering and vetoes, ambitious individuals resorted to force. And once violence was accepted as a political instrument, there was no turning back. Into this volatile milieu emerged three of Rome's most iconic figures: Pompey the Great, Marcus Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Their informal pact, known as the First Triumvirate, was conceived to pool their resources and influence to achieve their individual ambitions. Instead, it paved the way for the ultimate undoing of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar, hailed from an aristocratic lineage that traced its roots to the goddess Venus. However, his father had never attained the consulship, leaving the young Gaius with a strong desire to prove himself. In Roman society, eminence had to be both earned and inherited. One was not truly distinguished unless one matched or surpassed the accomplishments of one's ancestors. Caesar's ascent to power began with the understanding that politics in the late Republic demanded three essential components: military renown, immense affluence, and popular backing. He secured the first through his subjugation of Gaul, a campaign that brought all of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain under Roman dominion. The wealth derived from the spoils of these campaigns, while popular favor was cultivated through generous donations, spectacles, and public infrastructure projects. Yet, Caesar's most defining trait, the one that would ultimately lead to his downfall, was his unwillingness to accept constraints. When pirates apprehended him in his youth and demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, Caesar reportedly laughed and instructed them to increase their demand to 50, asserting his worth far exceeded their paltry sum. While awaiting the ransom, he engaged in banter with his captors, composed poetry, and vowed to return and crucify them all, a prospect the pirates found amusing. Upon his release, Caesar promptly assembled a fleet, apprehended the pirates, and had them crucified as promised. However, he demonstrated a degree of mercy by ordering their throats cut first to spare them prolonged suffering. This blend of unyielding resolve and strategic leniency would characterize his entire career. Caesar's alliance with Pompey and Crassus facilitated his attainment of the consulship in 59 BC. He utilized this position to enact legislation favorable to his associates while systematically dismantling any constitutional obstacle in his path. When his consular colleague attempted to oppose him, Caesar had the man's head plunged into a receptacle of filth. When tribunes sought to veto his decrees, Caesar disregarded them. When adversaries protested, Caesar inundated the forum with armed soldiers. All of this was technically within legal bounds. Caesar possessed imperium, the supreme authority vested in a Roman magistrate, rendering him immune from prosecution while in office. However, it was widely understood that once his consular term concluded, he would face charges for his unlawful actions. Caesar's solution was to secure a provincial governorship, ensuring his safe removal from Rome with his imperium intact until he could seek the consulship again. The governorship he acquired was that of Gaul, a post that included command of 4 legions and the opportunity for military glory. What ensued was nearly 8 years of continuous warfare. Caesar systematically conquered Celtic tribes, crossed the Rhine to intimidate Germanic peoples, and even launched 2 expeditions to Britain. His quote Igor became exemplary Latin prose and masterpieces of self-aggrandizement. Meanwhile, as Caesar garnered accolades in Gaul, the political climate in Rome grew increasingly unstable. Crassus met his end fighting the Parthians, thereby removing 1 member of the triumvirate. Pompey, envious of Caesar's accomplishments and apprehensive of his burgeoning influence, began to align himself with the senatorial faction. When Caesar's senatorial adversaries attempted to recall him from Gaul before he could stand for consul again, Caesar was faced with a critical decision. He could return to Rome as a private citizen and face almost certain prosecution, or he could cross the Rubicon River with his army and advance on Rome. Caesar opted for conflict. In 49 BC, he led his 13th legion across the Rubicon, purportedly uttering the now famous phrase, Quote 1. The die is cast. Pompey and the majority of the Senate fled to Greece, where they assembled an army to confront Caesar. The ensuing civil war raged for 4 years and profoundly reshaped the Roman world. Caesar's triumph at Pharsalus in 48 BC effectively marked the end of the Republic. Although Caesar maintained the pretense of restoring rather than dismantling Roman institutions, he extended clemency to most of his adversaries, revised the calendar, redistributed land to his veteran soldiers, and initiated ambitious construction projects. His most significant act, however, was his appointment as Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, in 44 BC. This move proved to be a step too far for many Romans. A group of senators, spearheaded by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, conspired to assassinate Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BC. According to the historical narrative, a soothsayer had warned Caesar to be wary of that particular day, and his wife Calpurnia had pleaded with him not to attend the Senate. Nevertheless, Caesar proceeded, driven perhaps by valor or overconfidence. As the conspirators surrounded him and commenced their attack, Caesar initially resisted until he recognized Brutus among his assailant. At that point, according to some accounts, he drew his toga over his head and submitted to his fate. The man who had shown mercy to his defeated foes was betrayed by those who had benefited from his clemency. Caesar's assassination was intended to reinstate the Republic, but it yielded the precise opposite outcome. Caesar enjoyed widespread popularity among the populace, and his demise created a power vacuum that could only be filled through force. The conspirators had eliminated the dictator, but they lacked any concrete plan for the subsequent events. Within hours, it became apparent that they had not salvaged the Republic. They had merely ensured its more violent demise. When Caesar was assassinated, scant attention was paid to his 18-year-old grandnephew, Gaius Octavius. The young man was studying in Greece when he learned of his great-uncle's death and his subsequent adoption into Caesar's will. However, Caesar had bequeathed Octavius something more valuable than wealth or property: his name. From that moment forward, the teenager would be known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's designated heir. The metamorphosis of this frail youth into Augustus, Rome's inaugural emperor, stands as one of history's most extraordinary political achievements. Octavian, as he is referred to by historians, possessed no military experience, no significant political affiliations, and no discernible talents, apart from a keen insight into Roman psychology and an unyielding determination in pursuing his objectives. His initial challenge was Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant and consul, who had secured possession of Caesar's documents and treasury and was positioning himself as the deceased dictator's successor. However, Octavian possessed Caesar's name and will, which proved more influential than Antony's official standing. Upon Octavian's arrival in Rome and his commencement of distributing Caesar's bequests to the populace, he was perceived as the rightful inheritor of the dictator's legacy. The intricate political maneuvers that followed saw Octavian alternately forming alliances with and engaging in conflict against both Antony and the Senate. When it served his interests, he allied with the senators against Antony. When this strategy was no longer advantageous, he marched on Rome with 8 legions and demanded to be appointed consul at the age of 19, decades younger than the legally stipulated minimum. The Second Triumvirate, established in 43 BC by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, represented a significantly different arrangement from the first. Whereas Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had been informal associates, the Second Triumvirate was legally constituted with dictatorial powers granted for a 5-year term. Their initial action was to compile proscription lists targeting their enemies, essentially state-sanctioned mass murder. Over 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians were condemned to death, their assets confiscated to finance the triumvir's military campaigns. Among the casualties was Cicero, Rome's most renowned orator, whose head and hands were affixed to the rostra in the Forum. The proscriptions eliminated the triumvir's political opponents while generating the necessary funds for their campaign against Caesar's assassins. The defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BC extinguished the final embers of hope for the Republic's restoration. It also precipitated a climactic confrontation between the 2 remaining triumvirs. Lepidus was marginalized, effectively exiled to a powerless priestly role, leaving Octavian and Antony to divide the Roman world between themselves. For over a decade, the 2 men maintained a tenuous peace while consolidating their power. Antony assumed control of the affluent eastern provinces and established an alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, the last Ptolemaic pharaoh. Their association was both political and personal, resulting in offspring. Concurrently, Octavian solidified his grip on Italy and the western provinces. He contended with persistent challenges, including food shortages, demands from veterans seeking land, and the disruptive naval actions of Pompey's son. Yet he progressively surmounted each obstacle. His greatest asset was Marcus Agrippa, a military genius who served as Octavian's general and engineer, constructing fleets and achieving victories, while his patron concentrated on politics. The final separation occurred when Antony divorced Octavian's sister, Octavia, and publicly wed Cleopatra, confirming the unspoken truth about their association. However, the true scandal lay in Antony's will, which Octavian somehow acquired and presented to the Senate. Within it, Antony designated Roman territories to his offspring with Cleopatra and expressed a desire for interment in Alexandria, not Rome. This provided the propaganda ammunition Octavian had been awaiting. He framed the ensuing conflict not as an internal Roman struggle, but as a foreign war against Cleopatra and her detrimental sway over Antony. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC was nearly an anticlimax. Antony and Cleopatra's naval forces retreated and fled before hostilities truly commenced. Both opted for suicide rather than face capture and disgrace in Rome. With their demise, Octavian, at 32 years of age, became the sole sovereign of the Roman world. Yet, unlike Caesar, who had ostentatiously displayed his authority and consequently met his end, Octavian recognized that Romans would only accept autocracy if it was presented as a revival of traditional governance. In 27 BC, Octavian addressed the Senate and dramatically reinstated the Republic, relinquishing his extraordinary authorities to the populace and their elected representatives. The appreciative senators promptly bestowed upon him new accolades, including the title Augustus, signifying my, quote, wow. Although Augustus proclaimed the restoration of the Republic, he maintained command of the military, the treasury, and the most crucial provinces. The system established by Augustus, termed the Principate, amounted to a masterpiece of political theatrics. Augustus renounced the title of king, a designation Romans still abhorred. Instead, he was the first citizen, coincidentally holding a collection of republican offices that granted him absolute authority. The Senate continued its sessions. Magistrates were elected annually, and the venerable customs of republican governance were upheld. Nevertheless, it was evident to all where true power resided. Augustus reigned for 45 years, fundamentally reshaping not only the Roman government but Roman society as a whole. He famously stated he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. More significantly, he instituted a framework that would persevere for centuries, fostering the stability that enabled Roman civilization to thrive across the Mediterranean basin. The passing of Augustus in 14 AD marked the conclusion of the Roman Republic's final epoch, and the commencement of what scholars refer to as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the subsequent 200 years, the Mediterranean world experienced unparalleled prosperity, security, and cultural flourishing under imperial dominion. This period represented the closest approximation to a golden age achievable in the ancient world. This is not to suggest that the empire was devoid of challenges. Augustus's immediate successors included some of history's most infamous figures. The reclusive and paranoid Tiberius, who spent his final years on the island of Capri, engaging in conduct that shocked even Roman sensibilities. Caligula, whose brief rule was characterized by megalomaniacal extravagance and peculiar conduct. Claudius, who oversaw the conquest of Britain and was potentially poisoned by his consort, and Nero, who may or may not have played the fiddle while Rome was engulfed in flames. Nevertheless, the brilliance of Augustus's system lay in its capacity to function effectively, even with incompetent emperors. The extensive imperial administration he had established continued its operations irrespective of the individual occupying the throne. Provincial governors dispensed justice, tax collectors amassed revenue, and military commanders safeguarded the borders, whether the emperor was capable or utterly deranged. The genuine test of the system occurred in 69 AD, the year of the four emperors, when Nero's suicide precipitated a civil war that saw 4 different individuals successively claim imperial authority. However, this crisis, which could have fractured the nascent republic, was resolved relatively swiftly. The victor, Vespasian, a pragmatic soldier from a middle-class background, stabilized the empire and established a new dynastic line. Vespasian's most significant accomplishment was the construction of the Colosseum, officially designated as the Flavian Amphitheater. This monumental edifice, capable of accommodating 50,000 spectators, became an emblem of Roman might and engineering expertise. Yet, it also symbolized a more somber aspect of Roman civilization, the nonchalant acceptance of violence as a form of entertainment. The spectacles held within the Colosseum were both magnificent and horrifying. Gladiators engaged in mortal combat. Criminals were executed through elaborate dramatic reenactments of mythological narratives, and exotic animals were slaughtered in the thousands. These displays served multiple objectives. They entertained the populace, demonstrated Roman dominance over nature and adversaries, and provided an outlet for the aggressive impulses that had once destabilized the Republic. Despite its inherent brutality, the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD achieved remarkable feats. Roman law furnished a consistent legal framework across diverse populations and cultures. Roman engineering linked the Mediterranean world through an unparalleled network of roads, aqueducts, harbors, and public edifices. The Roman peace facilitated burgeoning trade and urban expansion. Perhaps of paramount importance, Roman citizenship was progressively extended to encompass an increasing number of the empire's inhabitants. While other ancient empires maintained stark distinctions between rulers and subjects, Rome offered a pathway to integration. A Greek could attain Roman status. A Gaul could ascend to the Senate. A Spaniard could even become emperor. This policy of inclusivity was not driven by modern notions of equality, but by the pragmatic Roman understanding that diversity constituted strength. The Emperor Trajan, who governed from 98 to 117 AD, represented the empire at its zenith. Born in Spain to a Roman colonial family, he served with distinction in the military and expanded Roman territory to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia and briefly occupying Mesopotamia. His column in Rome, adorned with spiraling reliefs depicting his Dacian campaigns, still stands as a testament to Roman military prowess. However, perhaps more striking than Trajan's conquests were his public works. He commissioned new forums, new bathhouses, new harbors, and the expansive market complex that continues to bear his name. Like the most exemplary Roman emperors, he understood that power resided not solely in military victories, but also in enhancing the lives of ordinary citizens. Roman emperors were expected to provide, quote, sustenance and amusement to maintain the contentment of the urban masses. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, embodied a different facet of Roman excellence. While Trajan was a conqueror, Hadrian was a builder and administrator. He traversed the empire extensively, founding cities, reinforcing fortifications, and personally overseeing everything from military encampments to legal proceedings. His wall across northern Britain, erected to repel the unconquered Pictish tribes, remains one of the most impressive Roman archaeological sites. Hadrian also possessed a profound appreciation for Greek culture and philosophy. He oversaw the reconstruction of Athens, established cities in the Greek style, and was notably known for his romantic involvement with a young Greek man named Antinous, whose demise prompted unprecedented displays of imperial mourning. This synthesis of Roman practicality and Greek intellectualism characterized the empire at its finest. The last of the 5 so-called good emperors was Marcus Aurelius, whose philosophical meditations offer a remarkable insight into the mind of an ancient ruler. Here was a man wielding absolute authority over 60 million people, yet he dedicated his leisure time to composing stoic reflections on duty, mortality, and the principles of righteous living. His meditations, never intended for public dissemination, reveal an individual perpetually striving to uphold his own moral standards. Nevertheless, even Marcus Aurelius confronted challenges that foreshadowed the empire's future difficulties. He spent the majority of his reign engaged in combat against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier, conducting defensive rather than aggressive campaigns. The era of easy conquests had concluded. Rome now faced adversaries who had assimilated knowledge from centuries of interaction with Roman military tactics. Furthermore, Marcus's son, Commodus, proved to be a disastrous emperor, more preoccupied with gladiatorial contests than with governance. His assassination in 192 AD brought the Antonine dynasty to an end and instigated another period of civil war. The age of the benevolent emperors had passed, and the empire was on the cusp of facing its most severe crisis. The 3rd century AD represented the closest Rome came to utter disintegration. Between 235 and 284 AD, more than 20 emperors governed the empire, the majority meeting violent ends. Barbarian incursions breached the frontiers with relative ease. The economy collapsed, plague decimated the population, and the empire fragmented into 3 distinct entities for a period. It was a catastrophe on par with the fall of the Republic, but this time there would be no Augustus to readily reinstate order. The crisis originated from the inherent weaknesses of the imperial system itself. Roman emperors had consistently relied on the military for their ascent to power. However, by the 3rd century, this relationship had become detrimental. Soldiers demanded increased remuneration, which emperors supplied by debasing the currency, leading to inflation and necessitating even higher pay. Moreover, armies in various provinces began to proclaim their own commanders as emperors, resulting in perpetual civil strife. The so-called barracks emperors of this era were largely career soldiers who had advanced through the ranks. They possessed military expertise but lacked statecraft acumen, and their reigns were typically brief and violent. An emperor might vanquish external foes only to be assassinated by his own troops, who would then elevate his successor, perpetuating the same cycle of violence. External pressures exacerbated the situation. New confederations of Germanic tribes, including the Franks, Alemanni, and Goths, pressed against the Rhine and Danube frontiers with unprecedented coordination and force. In its eastern territories, the Sasanian Empire of Persia displayed greater assertiveness than its Parthian predecessor, successfully conquering Roman lands and even achieving the capture of Emperor Valerian in 260 AD. Perhaps most symbolically damaging, barbarian groups penetrated the Italian peninsula for the first time in many centuries. Rome, which had not faced foreign threats since the era of Hannibal, was compelled to undertake significant reconstruction of its defensive walls. The psychological ramifications were profound. The Eternal City no longer felt secure. In response to these mounting pressures, the empire began to fracture. In 260 AD, Roman general Postumus established an independent Gallic empire, encompassing Britain, Gaul, and Spain. His avowed aim was not to dismantle Rome, but rather to defend these provinces more capably than distant emperors could. Concurrently, in the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out its own dominion, extending over Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. For a period, 3 distinct Roman empires coexisted, each asserting its legitimacy while governing separate territories. The Central Empire, reduced to Italy and the Balkans, appeared to be on the precipice of complete disintegration. Trade routes faltered, urban centers shrank, and many questioned whether this signaled the end of Roman civilization. The empire was ultimately salvaged by a succession of exceptional soldier emperors who blended military prowess with administrative acumen. Claudius Gothicus repelled a significant Gothic incursion, earning him his distinctive epithet. Aurelian successfully reconquered the Palmyrene and Gallic empires, thereby reunifying the Roman world under a single leader and acquiring the title Restorer of the World. However, the most impactful reforms were implemented during the reign of Diocletian, who governed from 284 to 305 AD. Diocletian recognized that the empire had become too vast and intricate for one ruler. His solution was the Tetrarchy, a system of rule by 4 emperors, comprising 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, who shared administrative and military duties. Diocletian also relocated the imperial capital from Rome, establishing his court at Nicomedia in Asia Minor. While Rome retained symbolic significance, the practical nexus of power shifted eastward toward the empire's more affluent and populous regions. This geographic recalibration would exert considerable influence on future developments. Crucially, Diocletian segregated military and civil appointments, thereby terminating the pattern of generals assuming emperorship by controlling armies. He also revised the currency system, restructured taxation, and mandated maximum prices for goods to counteract inflation. These reforms proved effective, stabilizing the empire and ensuring its endurance for subsequent centuries. Nevertheless, the cost of these measures was substantial. The Roman Empire emerging from the crisis of the 3rd century differed markedly from the one that had entered it. The fluid classical civilization of the Antonine Age gave way to a more rigidly controlled bureaucratic structure. Individual liberties were relinquished in favor of collective security. The empire survived, but it was no longer the same entity. The complete transformation of the Roman Empire was a process finalized by Constantine the Great, who reigned from 306 to 337 AD. Constantine's rule represented several pivotal junctures. These included the adoption of Christianity as the empire's favored faith, the establishment of Constantinople as a new Rome, and the definitive abandonment of republican institutions in favor of absolute monarchy. Constantine ascended to power following a civil war, defeating his rivals at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. According to Christian accounts, he purportedly experienced a pre-battle vision of a cross in the sky bearing the inscription, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this vision was real, fabricated, or politically motivated remains a subject of debate, but Constantine unequivocally attributed his triumph to the Christian God. The Edict of Milan, in 313 AD, legalized Christianity throughout the empire, bringing an end to centuries of intermittent persecution. While this did not yet constitute the formal establishment of Christianity as the state religion, it signaled a fundamental alteration in the empire's relationship with its largest religious minority. Constantine's personal devotion to Christianity grew over time. He postponed his baptism until his deathbed, a common practice of the era, yet he demonstrably favored Christian officials, commissioned the construction of magnificent churches, and actively participated in theological debates. Most significantly, he convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to address the Arian controversy, thereby affirming the emperor's authority over church doctrine. Perhaps even more consequential than his religious policies was Constantine's decision to found a new capital. Constantinople, erected on the site of ancient Byzantium, was conceived as a Christian Rome, devoid of pagan temples or republican traditions. Its strategic position, commanding the Bosporus Strait, rendered it the natural hub for administering the empire's eastern provinces. The establishment of Constantinople also mirrored the empire's eastward shift. The prosperous cities of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt had long surpassed the Latin West in wealth. By situating his capital in the Greek-speaking East, Constantine acknowledged the future trajectory of the empire. Under Constantine and his successors, the Roman Empire became increasingly Christian and increasingly autocratic. The emperor was no longer the preeminent citizen of a restored republic, but rather the earthly representative of God, ruling by divine right. Courtly rituals evolved into elaborate displays emphasizing the emperor's sacred status, while access to the imperial presence grew progressively restricted. This transformation was not instantaneous or uniform. Julian the Apostate briefly sought to reinstate paganism in the 360s, and various emperors grappled with the intricate relationship between imperial authority and Christian dogma. Nonetheless, the overarching trend was clear. The Roman Empire was evolving into a Christian monarchy, substantially different from the pagan republic that had conquered the Mediterranean. The Christianization of the empire engendered profound cultural consequences. Classical literature, art, and philosophy fell under suspicion due to their pagan origins. Ancient temples were either closed or repurposed as churches. The Olympic Games, tainted by their association with Greek polytheism, were eventually abolished. Yet Christianity also served to preserve a considerable amount of classical knowledge. Christian scholars, such as Augustine, integrated classical philosophy with Christian theology, while monastic communities safeguarded ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. The interplay between Christianity and classical culture was complex, encompassing both destruction and preservation. By 380 AD, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Paganism was officially proscribed, although it persisted in rural areas for centuries. The transformation that had commenced with Constantine's vision was now complete. Rome had become a Christian empire, and Christianity had become a Roman religion. The death of Theodosius I in 395 AD marked the definitive division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves, each governed by one of his sons. This partition, initially intended as a temporary administrative measure, solidified into a permanent reality that would profoundly shape European and Mediterranean history for the ensuing millennium. The Western Empire, with its capital at Rome, and later Ravenna, encompassed Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa. The Eastern Empire, administered from Constantinople, controlled the Balkans, Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt. In theory, both emperors presided over a single Roman Empire, but in practice, they frequently acted as rivals rather than partners. The division reflected inherent disparities between the empire's two components. The West was less affluent, less urbanized, and more susceptible to barbarian incursions. Its economy was largely agrarian, and its cities had been in decline since the 3rd century crisis. The East, conversely, controlled the ancient centers of commerce and culture, including Athens, Ephesus, Antioch, and Alexandria, and its economy remained robust. These economic divergences proved critical, as both halves of the empire faced escalating pressure from barbarian peoples beyond their frontiers. The Huns, migrating westward from the Asian steppes, displaced Germanic tribes who sought refuge within Roman territory. What ensued was less an invasion than a massive migration that the empire struggled to contain. The Western emperors, lacking the resources to militarily resist these migrations, attempted to manage them through diplomacy and integration. Germanic tribes were settled within Roman lands as foederati, allied peoples who provided military service in exchange for land and Roman recognition of their leaders. This policy offered temporary success, but progressively eroded Roman authority as barbarian chieftains gained ascendancy over Roman officials. The Eastern emperors, benefiting from greater resources and shorter frontiers, could afford to be more selective. They frequently diverted barbarian pressure westward, effectively bribing tribes to attack the Western Empire rather than their own. This strategy served Constantinople's interests well, but ultimately dashed any hopes of Western recovery. The most striking illustration of barbarian migration was the career of Attila the Hun. His confederation of tribes terrorized both halves of the empire during the 440s and 450s, extorting immense tribute payments and posing a direct threat to Rome itself. The renowned encounter between Attila and Pope Leo in 452 AD, where the Pope purportedly persuaded the Hunnic leader to spare Rome, underscored the growing replacement of imperial officials by Christian leaders as the true power brokers in the West. The final century of the Western Empire was characterized by a succession of ineffectual emperors who were largely dominated by barbarian generals. These Germanic commanders, Stilicho, Ricimer, Odoacer, often exhibited more Roman characteristics than their nominal superiors. Having been raised within the imperial structure and internalizing Roman values. However, their foremost allegiance was to their own kin rather than to abstract entities like the Roman state. Britain was forsaken first around 410 AD, when Emperor Honorius purportedly instructed the Romano-Britons to assume responsibility for their own defense. North Africa succumbed to the Vandals in the 430s, severing a vital conduit for tax revenue and grain provisions. Gaul was partitioned among the Franks, Visigoths, and Burgundians. By 450 AD, the Western Empire's dominion was largely confined to Italy. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire not only persevered, but occasionally attempted to reclaim territories lost to the West. Emperor Majorian briefly reinstated Roman authority in Gaul and Spain during the 450s, but his success proved ephemeral. The East grappled with its own challenges, including incursions by Huns and Persians, alongside internal religious schisms. The conventional date for the demise of the Western Roman Empire is 476 AD, when the Germanic king Odoacer deposed the final Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and forwarded the imperial regalia to Constantinople. However, this event was less momentous than it might initially appear. By 476, the Western Empire had dwindled to little more than Italy. Even there, actual authority resided not with emperors, but with barbarian chieftains. Romulus Augustulus was a child, perhaps 14 years of age, elevated to the throne by his father, the general Orestes. When Orestes refused to grant his Germanic troops the lands they demanded, they revolted under Odoacer's command. The deposition of Romulus was nearly bloodless. He was simply granted a pension to live quietly in Campania. Odoacer's dispatch to the Eastern Emperor Zeno asserted that the West no longer required its own emperor, as a single ruler in Constantinople sufficed for the entire empire. This was a face-saving stratagem that allowed everyone to maintain the illusion of restored imperial unity rather than acknowledging the West's conquest by barbarians. In reality, the Western Roman Empire had been evolving into a collection of Germanic kingdoms for decades. The Visigoths governed Spain. The Vandals held sway over North Africa. The Franks commanded northern Gaul, and various other tribes had established domains throughout the former western provinces. These kingdoms retained numerous Roman institutions and customs, yet they were no longer Roman in any substantive manner. Consequently, the fall of Rome in 476 represented more of a final acknowledgement of a process that had been ongoing for generations. Roman civilization in the West did not vanish abruptly. Latin persisted as the language of law, governance, and educated discourse. Roman legal principles continued to regulate legal relationships. Former Roman cities remained hubs of commerce and culture. What dissipated was the singular Roman state that had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries. In its stead emerged a mosaic of kingdoms that preserved certain Roman traditions while cultivating their own distinctive characteristics. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, founded by Theodoric in 493 AD, consciously endeavored to uphold Roman traditions, even reinstating the Senate and staging traditional games in the Circus Maximus. Nevertheless, even as the Western Empire politically fragmented, Roman cultural influence endured. The Germanic kings who succeeded the Roman emperors frequently adopted Roman titles, employed Roman administrators, and adhered to Roman legal precedents. They recognized that Rome's power stemmed not solely from military might, but from a superior system of governance and jurisprudence. The Catholic Church played a pivotal role in safeguarding Roman traditions. As imperial authority waned, bishops frequently assumed the effective leadership of their cities. The Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, claimed jurisdiction not only over spiritual matters, but also over temporal affairs. In many respects, the medieval papacy inherited the universalist aspirations of the Roman Empire. Latin also ensured the persistence of Roman influence. As the language of the church, law, and educated discourse, Latin continued to evolve in the post-imperial West. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, are all descended from Latin, perpetuating Roman linguistic influence across a significant portion of Europe. Perhaps most crucially, the concept of Rome transcended the collapse of the Roman state. Medieval rulers, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, laid claim to restoring or continuing the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, established in 800 AD, explicitly asserted its lineage as the successor to ancient Rome. Even in contemporary times, concepts such as republic, citizenship, and law trace their origins to Roman antecedents. While the Western Roman Empire disintegrated into Germanic kingdoms, the Eastern Empire not only survived, but thrived. Centered in Constantinople, this eastern continuation of Rome would persist for an additional millennium, preserving Roman law, Roman institutions, and Roman identity long after the Western collapse. Modern scholars often refer to this eastern continuation as the Byzantine Empire. However, its inhabitants identified themselves as Romans. They designated their realm as Romania and their emperor as the Basileus ton Romeon, emperor of the Romans. Their laws were Roman, their administration was Roman, and their sense of identity was firmly rooted in the Roman past. The Eastern emperors never acknowledged the Western collapse as terminal. Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565 AD, initiated ambitious military campaigns to reconquer the lost Western territories. His general Belisarius recaptured North Africa from the Vandals and a substantial portion of Italy from the Ostrogoths, temporarily re-establishing Roman rule in these regions. However, Justinian's conquests proved unsustainable. The resources directed towards Western campaigns left the eastern frontiers vulnerable to Persian assaults, while plague and excessive taxation weakened the empire internally. Within a generation of Justinian's demise, most of his reconquests had been lost to new incursions. The Lombards occupied Italy, the Slavs entered the Balkans, and the Arabs advanced across the southern Mediterranean. The Arab conquests of the 7th century were arguably more calamitous for the Eastern Empire than the Germanic invasions had been for the West. Within decades, the Arabs had subjugated Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, some of the empire's wealthiest and most populous provinces. Constantinople itself endured multiple sieges, but held firm, protected by its formidable walls and the clandestine weapon of Greek fire. These losses compelled the Eastern Empire to reinvent itself. The Greek-speaking regions of Asia Minor and the Balkans became the empire's core, while Latin gradually receded from official usage. The theme system, which integrated military and civil administration under regional commanders, superseded the older administrative structure of separate military and civilian hierarchies. Despite these adversities, the Eastern Roman Empire experienced a golden age during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Macedonian dynasty oversaw military triumphs that reclaimed much of Asia Minor and extended Byzantine influence into the Balkans and southern Italy. Constantinople emerged as the largest and most opulent city in Europe, a cosmopolitan nexus of trade, art, and scholarship. Byzantine scholars preserved a significant portion of classical Greek literature that might otherwise have been lost. The Bibliotheca, compiled by Photius in the 9th century, summarizes hundreds of ancient works, many of which survive solely through his descriptions. Monastic libraries safeguarded manuscripts of Greek classics, mathematical treatises, and scientific works, which were subsequently transmitted to the Islamic world and medieval Europe. The Byzantine Empire also cultivated its own distinctive artistic and architectural traditions. The Hagia Sophia, constructed under Justinian, remained the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly a millennium. Byzantine mosaics, characterized by their gold backgrounds and stylized figures, created a visual idiom that influenced art from Russia to Sicily. Religious controversies marked a considerable portion of Byzantine history. The iconoclastic period of the 8th and 9th centuries witnessed emperors attempting to ban religious imagery, leading to civil strife and theological debates that persisted for over a century. The schism between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity, formalized in 1054 AD, reflected not only theological divergences, but also cultural and political rifts between the Greek East and the Latin West. Yet, despite all its accomplishments, the Eastern Roman Empire faced the same fundamental challenges that had led to the West's downfall: barbarian encroachment, internal dissensions, and the immense costs of defending vast frontiers. The ascendancy of the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century resulted in the loss of much of Asia Minor to the empire. Subsequently, the Fourth Crusade in 1204 saw Western Christians sack Constantinople itself, fragmenting the empire for over 50 years. The Byzantine Empire that re-emerged after the Latin occupation of Constantinople in 1261 was a pale shadow of its former eminence. Reduced to Constantinople, portions of Greece, and scattered territories in Asia Minor, it contended with the burgeoning power of the Ottoman Turks, while grappling with internal discord and economic decline. The civil wars of the 14th century further debilitated the empire. The dispute between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzenos fractured Byzantine society and enabled the Ottomans to establish their initial permanent foothold in Europe. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire controlled little more than Constantinople itself and a few dispersed enclaves. Nonetheless, even in its decline, Byzantium retained its cultural vitality. The Palaiologan Renaissance of the 13th and 14th centuries yielded remarkable artistic, literary, and scholarly works. Byzantine scholars like Gemistos Plethon played a crucial role in transmitting Greek learning to the Italian Renaissance, while the empire's diplomatic traditions influenced European statecraft. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople in 1453 marked the inevitable culmination of centuries of decline. Sultan Mehmed II deployed massive cannons capable of breaching the city's ancient fortifications, while Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX met his end fighting valiantly on the ramparts. The fall of Constantinople marked the demise of the final vestige of the Roman Empire, although Greek culture persisted and thrived under Ottoman governance. The historical significance of 1453 transcends the conclusion of a medieval empire. The collapse of Constantinople prompted numerous Greek scholars to seek refuge in Western Europe, carrying with them manuscripts and knowledge that significantly contributed to the flourishing of the Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire, established in place of Byzantium, absorbed much from its predecessor, preserving the administrative prowess and refined culture that characterized the Eastern Roman Empire. The narrative of Rome did not cease with Constantinople's fall in 1453. Rome's influence continued to shape European civilization through its contributions to law, language, architecture, and political philosophy. The medieval Holy Roman Empire asserted its claim to uphold Roman traditions, while the papacy maintained Roman administrative methodologies and Latin culture. Roman law, codified by Justinian, formed the bedrock of legal frameworks across Europe. Concepts such as citizenship, constitutional governance, and the rule of law all trace their origins to Roman precedents. Even revolutionary movements, like the American and French revolutions, drew inspiration from the Roman Republic, viewing figures like Cincinnatus and Brutus as exemplars of civic virtue. The Latin language ensured the survival of Roman culture long after the empire's political dissolution. It not only evolved into the Romance languages, but also remained the lingua franca of scholarship, diplomacy, and the Catholic Church until modern times. Latin literature served as a source of inspiration for medieval and Renaissance writers, and Roman historical accounts influenced political discourse for centuries. Roman engineering marvels continued to inspire awe in subsequent generations. Aqueducts constructed during the empire supplied water to European cities well into the modern era. Roman roads served as the primary arteries for European transportation networks, and the architectural principles pioneered by Roman builders left an indelible mark on everything from medieval cathedrals to Renaissance palaces and contemporary government structures. Perhaps most crucially, Rome provided the blueprint for imperial aspirations that would repeatedly surface throughout history. Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon's continental system, and even the modern European Union all bear the imprint of Roman dreams of Mediterranean unity. The notion that diverse populations can be unified under common laws and institutions stands as one of Rome's most enduring contributions to political thought. The Roman Empire's approach to cultural diversity foreshadowed modern concepts of multiculturalism. While Roman attitudes toward conquered populations were far from enlightened by present-day standards, Their willingness to extend citizenship and incorporate foreign customs stood in stark contrast to the ethnic exclusivity prevalent in many ancient societies. Even Rome's shortcomings offer valuable lessons. The corruption that plagued the late Republic, the military instability of the 3rd century, and the religious conflicts of the late Empire collectively illustrate the inherent fragility of political structures and the paramount importance of civic virtue. The Roman experience serves as a potent reminder that even the most formidable civilizations are subject to mortality. The narrative we have examined tonight spans over 2 millennia, from the mythical founding of Rome in 753 BC to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. It is a chronicle of extraordinary success, followed by an inevitable decline, a testament to human accomplishment overshadowed by human fallibility, and of grand ambitions ultimately constrained by geography, economics, and the limitations of pre-modern technology. Rome's success stemmed not from a single element, but from a confluence of circumstances. Geographic advantages, political adaptability, military innovation, cultural receptiveness, and, perhaps most significantly, an exceptional capacity for adaptation. When the monarchy became tyrannical, the Romans instituted a republic. When the republic proved insufficient for governing an empire, they embraced imperial rule. When traditional deities seemed inadequate, they adopted Christianity. This flexibility enabled Rome to weather crises that led to the downfall of other ancient civilizations, including the Gallic sack in 390 BC, Hannibal's invasion during the Second Punic War, the civil wars of the late Republic, and the crisis of the 3rd century. Any one of these calamities could have ended Roman history. Instead, the Romans learned from each ordeal and emerged stronger. However, adaptation has its inherent limitations. The Roman Empire established by Constantine differed substantially from the Republic that had subjugated the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire that succumbed in 1453 bore scant resemblance to the classical civilization of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. In their efforts to preserve themselves, the Romans gradually transformed into something entirely different. The ultimate reasons for Rome's decline continue to be a subject of debate among historians. Some point to external factors such as barbarian incursions, plagues, climatic shifts, and the rise of Christianity. Others emphasize internal issues like political instability, economic disparities, military expenditures, and moral decay. In reality, Rome's downfall resulted from a complex interplay of numerous factors that proved too overwhelming even for Rome's remarkable adaptability. Perhaps the most astonishing aspect of Roman civilization is not that it eventually fell, all human institutions are transient, but rather its remarkable longevity and the vast scope of its achievements. Few states in human history have maintained political cohesion across such expansive territories for such extended durations. Even fewer have bequeathed such enduring cultural legacies. The Roman Empire, at its zenith, governed approximately 60 million individuals across 3 continents. It provided them with a unified legal system, a common currency, secure transportation networks, and relative peace. While this system was predicated on slavery and conquest, and while it was hierarchical and often ruthless, it represented the most successful endeavor at Mediterranean unification prior to the modern European Union. Rome's cultural contributions were equally impressive. Roman literature, art, architecture, and law provided models that influenced European civilization for millennia. Roman concepts of citizenship, constitutional governance, and imperial administration shaped political thought from the Middle Ages through the Enlightenment. Even today, when we refer to republics, senates, or citizens, we are employing Roman terms for Roman concepts. As we draw near the conclusion of our extensive exploration of Roman history, it feels appropriate to return to Rome itself. Not the empire that once spanned 3 continents, but the city where it all began. Throughout its history, the city of Rome remained symbolically central to Roman identity, even as political power shifted to Constantinople or as barbarian kings reigned from Ravenna. Modern visitors to Rome can still trace the layers of its past. The Roman Forum, where Cicero delivered his orations and Caesar met his end, lies in ruins but remains recognizable. The Colosseum continues to dominate the city's skyline, while aqueduct arches traverse the countryside as they did 2 millennia ago. The Pantheon, constructed under Hadrian, endures as one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. Yet Rome is not merely a museum. The city that began as a cluster of mud huts on 7 hills continues to evolve. Medieval churches incorporate ancient columns. Renaissance palaces are erected upon classical foundations. And contemporary Romans navigate streets first laid out by ancient urban planners. The continuity is truly remarkable. In Rome, the present and the past coexist in a manner found nowhere else on earth. The Bishop of Rome, asserting authority as St. Peter's successor, gradually emerged as the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. In many respects, the medieval papacy inherited the universalist aspirations of the Roman Empire. Just as Roman law had once governed the Mediterranean world, canon law now governed Catholic Europe. And just as Roman engineers had constructed roads to link the empire, papal legates established networks that bound medieval Christendom together. The language of ancient Rome evolved, but never vanished. Ecclesiastical Latin preserved classical grammar and vocabulary, while spoken Latin gradually developed into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Today, billions of people speak languages descended from the tongue of Caesar and Augustus, making Latin arguably the most successful language in human history. Roman law proved equally enduring. Justinian's codification became the foundation for legal systems across Europe and its colonies. Concepts such as innocence until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, and equality before the law all have Roman origins. Modern legal terminology remains heavily Latin-infused, preserving Roman legal concepts within contemporary jurisprudence. Even Roman engineering principles continue to influence modern construction. The arch, the dome, and concrete construction all have Roman precedents. Modern urban planning, with its emphasis on straight thoroughfares, public squares, and sanitation systems, follows patterns established by Roman urban designers. When we turn on a tap and expect potable water or flush a toilet and anticipate waste removal, we are benefiting from Roman innovations. As we settle more deeply into our cushions and allow the long saga of Rome to wash over us, it is worth considering why this ancient civilization continues to captivate our attention. Part of the explanation lies in its sheer scale. Rome's accomplishments were simply immense, rivaling the ambitions of any society in human history. However, scale alone does not account for Rome's lasting appeal. Perhaps we are drawn to Rome because it feels remarkably familiar. Roman political debates concerning taxation, immigration, and military intervention could easily be extracted from today's headlines. Roman laments about moral decline, political corruption, and economic inequality echo concerns voiced in every generation. The Romans grappled with many of the same predicaments we encounter today, offering reassurance that our own issues can potentially be resolved. Rome additionally captivates us due to its fundamentally utilitarian nature. While other ancient societies were dictated by priest-kings asserting divine mandate, Rome cultivated systems rooted in practical experience rather than religious dogma. The Roman constitution underwent development through experimentation, integrating successful components while abandoning unsuccessful ones. This evidence-based approach to governance appears remarkably contemporary. Concurrently, Rome's setbacks serve as cautionary tales regarding the precariousness of civilized existence. The transformation of the Roman Republic into an autocratic empire underscores the necessity of perpetual vigilance to safeguard democratic institutions. The civil wars of the late Republic vividly illustrate the speed at which constitutional government can disintegrate when political conventions are disregarded. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire demonstrates how the convergence of external pressures and internal vulnerabilities can dismantle even the most formidable states. Factors such as climate change, epidemics, economic disparities, political fragmentation, and military overextension all contributed to Rome's decline. These elements remain pertinent as we confront our own global challenges. Nevertheless, Rome also exemplifies human resilience. On numerous occasions, Romans confronted existential crises and discovered avenues for survival. The sack of Rome by the Gauls, Hannibal's invasion, the crisis of the 3rd century, and the barbarian migrations. Each challenge appeared to herald the doom of Roman civilization. Instead, the Romans adapted, reformed, and persevered. Their example reminds us that setbacks are not necessarily permanent. Rome's cultural heritage may constitute its most significant contribution to human civilization. The notion that diverse populations can be unified under shared laws and institutions, that merit should take precedence over lineage, and that governance should serve the collective well-being, these concepts all originate from Roman thought. Although the Romans frequently fell short of their own ideals, those ideals continue to serve as inspiration. Roman literature, art, and architecture provide aesthetic benchmarks that have shaped Western culture for 2 millennia. The Aeneid remains among the most accomplished epic poems ever composed. While Roman historians like Tacitus and Livy established enduring standards for historical writing, Roman architectural principles are evident in governmental buildings, churches, and monuments worldwide. Perhaps most critically, Rome impresses upon us that civilization is both precious and vulnerable. The Romans forged a world of unparalleled prosperity, security, and cultural achievement. However, they also revealed how rapidly such accomplishments can be lost through conflict, disease, political instability, and societal decay. Their experience should motivate us to cherish and maintain the institutions that enable civilized life. As our exploration of Roman history concludes, we find ourselves returning to our origins, with narratives. The Romans recounted stories of their inception to elucidate their identity and ancestry. We, in turn, narrate tales of the Romans to comprehend our own world and our place within it. Ultimately, history is about storytelling, about discerning patterns and significance within the chaos of human experience. The narrative of Rome is compelling because it encompasses all the elements of grand drama: humble beginnings, a spectacular ascent, internal strife, external adversaries, moral dilemmas, tragic imperfections, and an inevitable descent. It is a story that resonates on multiple levels, as political history, military history, social history, cultural history, and moral allegory. However, it is also a narrative that perpetually endures. Each generation rediscovers Rome and uncovers new interpretations of its past. Medieval chroniclers viewed Rome as the penultimate great empire preceding Christ's return. Renaissance humanists perceived Republican Rome as a paradigm of civic virtue. Enlightenment thinkers employed Roman examples to critique monarchical and aristocratic rule. Modern historians have scrutinized Roman slavery, the role of women, and environmental factors in imperial decline. Each era finds specific aspects of Roman history relevant to its contemporary concerns. During the Cold War, historians highlighted parallels between Roman expansion and America's global influence. Today, scholars focus on issues such as immigration, multiculturalism, and the sustainability of imperial systems. Rome functions as a mirror, reflecting our own societies, mirroring our aspirations, anxieties, and preoccupations. The material remnants of Roman civilization continue to surprise and inspire us. Archaeological findings consistently refine our understanding of Roman life. Advanced techniques enable us to decipher texts from charred papyri discovered at Pompeii, analyze DNA from Roman skeletal remains, and reconstruct ancient climates using ice cores and tree rings. Even 2 millennia after the zenith of their civilization, the Romans continue to impart lessons. Yet, notwithstanding our rigorous scholarly analysis, perhaps the most significant lesson Rome imparts is humility. The Romans were not superhuman. They erred, succumbed to avarice and ambition, and failed to uphold their own ideals. Nevertheless, they achieved extraordinary feats through collaboration, determination, and adaptability. Their example reminds us that ordinary individuals, working in concert over extended periods, can accomplish remarkable deeds. The story of Rome also underscores the importance of long-term perspective. Roman civilization was constructed by successive generations who embarked on projects they would never witness completed. They planted trees whose shade they would not experience, built roads they would not traverse, and established institutions that would outlast them for centuries. This readiness to invest in the future, to think beyond individual lifespans, was fundamental to Rome's success. As we approach sleep, with the rise and fall of Rome resonating in our thoughts, we might contemplate the legacy our own generation will bequeath. Will future historians ponder our achievements and failures as we ponder Rome's? What narratives will they construct about our era? What lessons will they glean from our triumphs and mistakes? Ultimately, Rome never truly fell because it never ceased evolving. The city-state transitioned into a republic. The republic evolved into an empire. The pagan empire embraced Christianity. The Western Empire succumbed while the Eastern persevered. Throughout these transformations, the concept of Rome persisted. Today, when we discuss republics and citizenship, when we employ Latin phrases and legal documents, when we admire dome structures or marvel at ancient aqueducts, Rome endures. The Romans believed in eternal recurrence, the notion that all phenomena cycle through endless repetition. Perhaps they were correct. The challenges they confronted, political polarization, economic inequality, military overstretch, immigration, climate change, disease, are issues we grapple with today. Their solutions, pragmatic adaptation, institutional flexibility, cultural synthesis, may provide guidance for our own predicaments. However, Rome also serves as a warning that no solution is eternal, and no accomplishment is everlasting. Even the most formidable empire eventually disintegrates. The wisest laws eventually become obsolete. The grandest cities eventually crumble into ruin. This realization should not engender despair, but should incite action. Understanding that our own civilization is ephemeral should motivate us to maximize our time, to build conscientiously, to consider future generations, and to create enduring works. The story of Rome is, fundamentally, a human story. It concerns individuals akin to ourselves, facing similar challenges, making choices comparable to those we confront daily. Some Romans prioritized personal gain over public welfare. Others relinquished all for their principles. Some embraced change. Others clung to outdated traditions. Some fostered connections between disparate peoples. Others erected barriers to exclude outsiders. These individual choices, amplified across millions of individuals over centuries, gave rise to the Roman civilization we have explored. Our individual choices, multiplied across billions of people in our own time, will shape the world that future generations inherit. The Romans remind us that history is not shaped by abstract forces, but by human decisions, by people choosing to cooperate or compete, to include or exclude, to construct or dismantle. As sleep begins to overtake us, and the protracted narrative of Rome settles into our dreams, we might recall that we are all inheritors of the Roman legacy. We speak languages derived from Latin, live under legal systems founded on Roman precedents, and participate in political structures that echo Roman innovations. The blood of Roman citizens, slaves, soldiers, and farmers flows within us. Their aspirations, accomplishments, and failures are integral to our heritage. The 7 hills beside the Tiber River, once a pasture for shepherds' flocks, became the nexus of the world. A cluster of mud dwellings evolved into marble temples. A band of refugees became masters of 3 continents. A nascent city-state forged a civilization that continues to shape our world. This serves as a reminder that great achievements can emerge from humble beginnings, and that human potential is limitless when guided by wisdom and sustained by cooperation. Therefore, rest now, assured that you are part of a narrative that commenced long before your birth and will persist long after your demise. You are connected to Romulus and Remus, to Caesar and Augustus, to Marcus Aurelius and Constantine, and to all the unremembered farmers, soldiers, and citizens who erected something grander than themselves, their legacy resides within you, just as your legacy will endure in future generations, who may one day recount tales of our own remarkable, imperfect, heroic, and tragic civilization. The eternal city slumbers, but Rome never truly perishes. It lives on in law and language, in art and architecture, and in the very concept that diverse populations can be unified under common institutions and shared ideals. As you transition into your tranquil sleep, keep in mind that you are an integral part of Rome's enduring narrative, a denizen of a world shaped by the Romans, a beneficiary of their accomplishments, and a keeper of their heritage. The account concludes where it commenced, acknowledging the transient nature of all human endeavors, the mortality of all civilizations, and the inevitability of every empire's decline. Nevertheless, it also concludes with the realization that our collective creations, the legal frameworks, languages, artistic expressions, and concepts that transcend individual lifespans, can attain a form of perpetuity. Rome may have fallen, but Roman civilization persists. Our present world will eventually vanish, yet the legacy we forge collectively, what we bequeath to subsequent generations, may prove just as everlasting. Therefore rest soundly, inhabitants of a timeless metropolis that resides not in a specific location, but within the human spirit that aspires to fairness, craves elegance, and holds the conviction that united, we can construct something deserving of commemoration. Good evening, and may your dreams be illuminated by the grandeur of ancient Rome and the anticipation of future triumphs.